Hi there. This is the UCLA Housing Voice podcast, and I am your host, Shane Phillips. Each episode, we discuss a different housing research paper with its author, translating it into non-academic language to better understand the challenges and potential solutions to the housing crisis. Baan Mankong is my host today, and our guest is Professor Hayden Shelby at the University of Cincinnati. Our interview is about slum upgrading and community finance and ownership in Bangkok, Thailand, where Professor Shelby spent several years doing on-the-ground research with both community organizations and governmental or quasi-governmental agencies. I think this is our first episode about housing policy in a country with a developing economy, so we're excited to try something new this week. The subject of our conversation today is a program called Baan Mankong, which translates to secure housing in Thai. The program's goal is to help residents of informal settlements, or slums, to form communities and access government-subsidized financing that can be used to improve their homes and provide the security that comes with legal ownership recognized by the state. Baan Mankong is much studied and much celebrated around the world, and it deserves to be lauded for helping more than 100,000 households in the 20 years that it's existed. Professor Shelby's paper interested us in part because it isn't merely celebratory, and instead offers what she calls a sympathetic critique of the program. A lot of our conversation is focused on the difference between using state authority to empower residents on the one hand, and offloading state responsibilities onto poor residents on the other. She puts it very succinctly when she says that the program, quote, blurs the boundaries between radical alternatives to the market and neoliberal alternatives to the state. And that fuzzy distinction is something I think we can also see to different extents in programs like community land trusts and tenant opportunity to purchase programs here in the States and elsewhere. The Housing Voice podcast is a production of the UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies. If you want to help the show, give us a 5-star rating and a review on your favorite podcast app, and be sure to tell your friends and colleagues to give us a listen. Here's Professor Hayden Shelby. Our guest this week is Hayden Shelby, assistant professor in the School of Planning at the University of Cincinnati, and we're going international again with a conversation about slum upgrading, collective finance, and community ownership and management in Bangkok, Thailand. Thanks for joining us, Professor Shelby, and welcome to the Housing Voice podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I've become a listener as of late, so I'm happy to be here.
We've said this multiple times, but I feel like this is our number one marketing strategy so far is just each person we interview is one new listener, and they hopefully share with others. So even though obviously many of the challenges that Bangkok residents might face could be different from those here in the US and other countries with more developed economies, I know that a lot of the questions we're going to be grappling with in this conversation are actually pretty similar to ones we're having here. Your abstract does a really great job actually of laying out what we'll be talking about. So let me just read the latter half of that right now. You say, quote, "In this article, I offer a sympathetic critique of Baan Mankong, the participatory slum upgrading program, by analyzing how this financial model actually plays out on the ground through an in-depth ethnographic study of the policy and its participants. I conclude that despite the policy's intentions to empower communities through access to collective finance, many participants find themselves struggling with debt and living under a new form of financialized community that reshapes their social relations with neighbors and burdens them with the responsibility for financing and carrying out development desired by the state," end quote. A big emphasis is also on the question of whether this program is empowering residents or if it's actually just offloading the responsibilities of the state onto them. And there's not a sharp dividing line between those two realities. I should also note that as long as we have a Bangkok housing expert, we're going to call you that here, we're going to learn all we can from you about this megacity's housing market and its urban planning and governance. So that's where we're headed. Professor Baan Mankong is my co-host this time. Happy New Year, Pavo.
Hey, Happy New Year, Managing Director of the Lewis Center Housing Initiative, Shane Phillips. It's great to see you, and welcome, Hayden. I'm really excited. I think this is the paper that has been fastest from learning about it to podcast so far. I just discovered it a few weeks ago, and I was so excited because I've been long interested in Cody and the Baan Mankong program, and I love the sympathetic critique approach because a lot of the stuff that's been written about it is just kind of pure laudatory, not that critical.
It's become a model.
Yeah,
it's become a model.
You know, and working in Hong Kong and in Indonesia, you hear a lot about this program, and so I think it's great that you've done this research on it. So I'm excited to talk to you about it.
Thank you. I'm excited to share some thoughts.
So first, we're going to go on our tour, and you've already informed me that we're going to be touring Bangkok this time. So tell us what we should see.
All right. So I am going to take you on a tour of what I consider sort of my neighborhood in Bangkok. It's along Ramkhamhaeng Road, near Ramkhamhaeng University. It's to the eastern side of the city, and it's not really super accessible by like SkyTrain, but it's relatively proximate to a lot of the organizations I did my research with. And there are a few things I want to show you. So first of all, if you're coming from the central city, the easiest way to get there, because Bangkok traffic is terrible, is the canal boat. So you get on in the canal boat, and this is like, it's one of the hidden gems of Bangkok, because first of all, it's very fast and efficient, but also it gives you this view of the city that you really feel like you're seeing the back of the city. In a really interesting way. And you're literally often looking at the backs of houses as you're going along. But there are also walkways along it. So you see people like going about their life. And it's this great way to see like the everyday aspects of Bangkok living. So you take the canal boat and you get off, around Ramkhamhaeng University. And it's a university area, so there's lots of cool shops, lots of young people, but it's also close to the Sports Authority of Thailand, where all of the countries, well, a lot of the country's elite athletes are sort of housed and where they train. And the best part about this location between the Sports Authority and the university is that a couple of evenings a week, there is a fantastic night market. And at this market, you can get electronics, you can get clothing, you can get housing goods. But for our purposes on this tour, you can get food from every part of the country sold in this market. So you can get, you know, any type of, any style of fried rice, lots of curries, plenty of mango and sticky rice, coconut ice cream, whatever you want. So I'm taking you, we get our food, and this is the really fun part, is that, so we're near where all of the elite athletes are, and close to this market, there are, takraw courts. And for listeners who don't know what takraw is, the best way to explain it is that it's volleyball you play with your feet. And there are these balls, they're originally kind of like wicker balls, but some of them are plastic. And really skilled players actually do play this like volleyball on two sides of a court, and they can spike these balls with their feet. They actually do like hitch kicks up in the air and invert themselves and spike the ball. And it's a sport that I had never encountered before spending time in Thailand. And it's to get the chance to just sort of casually see people who are really, really good at it play. That sort of combination of getting some food at the night market and watching like pick up takraw matches is like my favorite thing to do.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. I didn't tell Pavo this, but I went to Bangkok and Hanoi like 4 years ago, and mainly because of language barrier, I can barely remember like the names of any neighborhoods or anything. But the overwhelming takeaway for me was just the chaos of both cities. In like a good and a bad way, but it's just, and I'm sure this will come up when we're talking about the housing as well. It's just, there does not seem to be planning going on at all in the city. I'm sure there's something happening, but we'll get to that.
Yeah, it's funny. Whenever I'm in a taxi and people ask me what I'm doing and I tell them that I study city planning, they're like, well, it's a good thing you're here.
I mean, the irony about that is that's what they say everywhere. I mean, that's what they say in LA too, right?
That's absolutely true. You know, I'm sure people say that here as well. But yeah, I think one of I mean, you know, the what often looks like chaos is the fascinating thing to me about the city. It is so full of life.
Mm-hmm.
And I discover something new absolutely every day that I'm walking around that city.
Yeah. I was just walking like 20 miles every day, just seeing all I could. Okay, so before we talk about the cooperative housing finance program evaluated in your paper, we were hoping you could just give us an idea of what the housing policy landscape looks like in Bangkok. Pavo and I are starting, I think, from a very limited base here, so we'd be interested in just about anything you find interesting. In particular, I know we'd love to know your thoughts on David Dowell's articles about Bangkok, which we'll link to in the show notes, and what you think we should know about urban governance in Bangkok. Our US listeners may have heard about the political unrest in Thailand, so some of that background may be helpful for understanding the context of your research paper and the government's Community Organizations Development Institute program, or CODI, which Pavo referenced earlier.
Yeah. So I think I will start by saying, I think Thailand has had two claims to fame in the housing world over the past, let's say, 40 years. One is Baan Mankong, that we're going to talk about today. But the other one was sort of as an example of what in the 80s and 90s was known as the market enabling approach to producing housing in developing countries. And that's where these papers by David Dowell come in. So the idea here was that, so let's start back in, the 1960s. Like a lot of places in the world, Bangkok was rapidly urbanizing. The population was growing. There was, growth in slum settlements, and they experimented with a few different methods that were around the world. In 1972, they created a national housing authority and had, a similar experience to a lot of places. Just they went over budget, didn't produce enough units. They weren't of quality that people wanted, not in the right location. But what happened in Bangkok and in Thailand in general was that you have to remember that, for one thing, for about 10 years, it was the fastest growing economy in the world from like the mid 80s to the mid 90s. And what also happened during that time was that they really created this system that could produce a lot of housing by developers. So there were elements in which the regulations were, by relative standards, pretty transparent, not very onerous. They developed a financial system that could finance developer-built housing. And this all allowed them to just produce a whole lot of housing in the private market. That changed the urban landscape quite a bit. So it went from being, a place where you had lots of shop houses in a central city and enabled a lot of sprawl. So you got, some, what looked like classic, subdivisions further out on the periphery. And then later on, in that, towards the 90s, Bangkok really started to become condo land.
Could you, before we get there, could you quickly define shop houses, like what those look like?
Oh yeah, so shop houses, they kind of look like you might think of them as row houses. The bottoms of them kind of have often garage door opener or something, but where people run shops, or they might just have like a shop on the bottom, literally like there's a shop on the bottom and then people live on top.
Okay.
Yeah. So very, what we would call mixed use, in planning speak. Yeah, so Bangkok was producing a lot of housing via this market system. The market was enabled producing a lot of housing, and in a first study that David Dowell, along with I believe Shlomo Angel, within the research at least, they found that this was, I think as they put it, an efficiently performing housing market. That land prices weren't increasing that greatly. A lot was being produced. The production was starting to move down market. And the prediction was, I think that the slum population would start to become a smaller and smaller percentage of the overall population. And so it was held up as this example in a lot of ways. And I think that paper came out in 89 or I think it was
89, and there was a follow-up in 92.
In 92, yeah. And so in that just intervening few years, it's really interesting because he then comes in and my main takeaway from that paper is, actually the land prices are increasing a lot now. And I think what that paper really is catching is that Thailand, and Bangkok in particular, was at the beginning of a huge housing bubble. And so, fast forward and to condense a lot of very complicated stuff into a few sentences, that bubble, Thailand, the economy is growing massively. People are pouring a lot of the money that's coming into real estate. And in around 95, that bubble starts to burst. You start to see development companies going under. And this really presaged in, 1997. Eventually things get in bad condition. The government's forced to float the value of the baht. It collapses, and in July we get what in Thailand is called Wikrit Tom Yam Goong, or the Tom Yam Goong crisis, after the famous, sour spicy soup, which is sort of witty, at least cheeky and self-deprecating way of saying what we call the East Asian financial crisis. So I think that period laid the foundation for a lot of the housing in Bangkok. In the intervening decades, there was obviously a slump where there are a lot of ghost towers in Bangkok. But in recent years, you are increasingly seeing, Bangkok emerging as this aspirational world-class city. There are a lot of condos being developed. Still some, some sprawl and things like that. But I think from the sort of high level, of housing, that's what it looks like. But I think it's important to note that some of the predictions of how, the slum population would, maybe either be absorbed, into as the market went down market, or that they become a smaller proportion of the urban population. That did come true to a certain extent, but there was a very stubborn population in slum settlements, around 1 million for several decades in there. And that's that history. If I haven't gone on too long already, I would love to give the history of what was actually going on in housing in those settlements.
No, I think that's really important context. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was curious, especially in terms of the land tenure of the and how varied they are in the different settlements, because in different countries slums are quote unquote slums, right? Informal settlements arise, because of invasions or because of sales and or it's government land, and so that really can structure interventions as well.
Yeah. So. And I should say, I do use the term slum, in full recognition that it is a stigmatized term. I use it for a couple of reasons. The first is that some of the groups that I worked with in my research use it themselves as a reappropriation, as a political identity. But also, some of these settlements do kind of meet the UN criteria for how they classify slum. And also some of the euphemisms for some, like informal settlement, don't necessarily always reflect the reality of how people occupy their land. Mm-hmm. So in Bangkok, what's kind of unique about Bangkok as opposed to places where you have large scale land invasions or places like, Dharavi and Mumbai, which are like cities within cities. Mm-hmm. Settlements in Bangkok are relatively dispersed throughout the city and throughout the urban region. With the exception of Klong Toi, which is a fairly large settlement, a lot of these settlements have anywhere from a couple of dozen households to a few hundred. And there are several reasons for this. Some of it is the geography of Bangkok. A lot of the settlements are along canals, and the canals have kind of woven throughout the city. Some is because some of the settlements actually were there before the city got to them.
Mm-hmm. As it expanded outward.
Yeah, as the city expanded outward. And this is true even in relatively central parts of the city, that these settlements were actually there before the main effort to issue land titles in Bangkok even happened. These settlements were there, and kind of the people just weren't the ones who ended up with the titles. But a lot of times these settlements, they happen with either explicit written or sort of implicit permission of the landholder. So people will come in and maybe sometimes they pay a certain amount of rent. Sometimes they have verbal or a little bit of written permission. It's really common to have settlements on temples. on different types of government land. So a lot of settlements are on, the Crown Property Bureau, the State Railways of Thailand, the Treasury Department. These are all government entities that have a lot of settlements on their land. So I think that is the main sort of, if we're thinking about just the settlement patterns in Bangkok. And so that means that people have varying types of legal claims to the land. Some of, that with varying levels of formality over time. Some have gotten formal access to different types of utilities, water and electricity. Some haven't. Some have temporary land or housing registrations. Some don't. So there's a lot of variability in there.
And I assume that implies variability in terms of the residents' kind of socioeconomic status as well.
Yeah, definitely. So you might have someone who has informal land tenure, but is like a government bureaucrat and is like working, has a formal job, has quite a bit of education.
Right.
It's not at all uncommon to have people with college educations, and in fact, some of the really successful communities that do Baan Mankong are successful because they have educated people living among them. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Your paper is about this Baan Mankong program or secure housing program, and it's responding to some specific gaps in what the public and private sector are providing. We've talked about sort of the setting a little bit, but this program specifically, how does it work? What needs is it trying to address?
Yeah. So in order to answer that, I have to go back a little bit. We need to get into some of what was going on in some slum communities throughout the 80s and 90s and what kind of was the precursor to this. So you had in the 80s and 90s with some of what was going on in housing and rising land prices, you had a lot of evictions going on. You had also communities that were really coming together and trying to fight evictions, some on their own and really gaining some strength and some ability.
Who is doing the evictions in this case if there's not land titles involved?
So a lot of these, so it could be government agencies. That is less common than people who are private owners.
Okay.
It's really hard to achieve any type of either eviction delay or some of these like land sharing types of agreements that I can talk about. It's a lot harder to do that with a private owner. Mm-hmm. They're harder to shame. They're not as politically accountable. You have a lot more leverage when the landowning agency is a government entity. But there was a lot of capacity that was being built in these settlements, and it was happening through the residents themselves, but it was also happening through the growth of non-governmental organizations, of NGOs, which were being funded through efforts internationally to fund what was often thought of as good governance. Which basically meaning that they, in order to have a functioning democracy, you don't just want to like fund a central government. You want a whole civil society to be built up. So there was direct funding to NGOs. And in Thailand, this hit at a time when you had a lot of really idealistic young people, some of whom had cut their teeth in community-based work as student activists, some of whom were even in exile in the forest with the Communist Party of Thailand in the 70s and came back and started these organizations. And so when you get to the 80s and the 90s, when some of the precursors to Baan Mankong were started, you had a lot of capacity there. So Baan Mankong itself, in terms of housing, what it's addressing is sort of the fact that the market never moved down market enough to house a lot of people who are living in these settlements. But also the government's efforts through the National Housing Authority to build was like a lot of places. It wasn't meeting the needs of people. And so what Baan Mankong attempts to do is through a huge conglomeration of entities that collaborate, it tries to bring communities together gives them both a means of financing the development of new housing and communities. It gives them a means through which processes and assistance to negotiate legal forms of land tenure. And then in the process, and I think this is key for especially the people who are at the head of the organizations involved, it's not just about housing. They are really trying to build up communities and to try in order to do sometimes different things depending on the organization we're talking about. But I think that is the need. It is both about trying to get to do housing that is responsive to people's needs, but also about trying to really build up a civil society or a people's sector, depending on how you talk about it.
Could you walk us through the process of forming these cooperatives? Because it's like a whole series of steps, and it can be a high level summary, but I think it's important that we understand, and it explains how you end up with, not just the housing side of things, but also these other financial supports.
Yeah. And that's what really motivated my research project, was that, you have in a lot of the literature out there, these high level summaries, but then it's like, how does that actually happen? Mm-hmm. And it's a really onerous process. So communities, or I should say settlements, can come into Baan Mankong through a variety of means. Sometimes it is because they are immediately being threatened with eviction, and they get kind of referred to start the process. Sometimes it's because, Cody or leaders have negotiated the possibility to do legal tenure on a government agency's land. And so the process of forming the communities then starts with that, possibility of getting tenure there. So there's not like that immediate threat of eviction there. But what everything has in common is that they have to form a concrete community, not just like a sense of community, not just like your neighbors. Like they have to form this legal entity. Yeah. And the way that they start to do that is through savings. So they have to save 10% collectively of what they intend to borrow. They can borrow up to, it started at 300,000 baht. It's been, increasing, over time. Which you say
is about $15,000 USD.
It's like, roughly. I think it's about 10. Yeah, between 10 and 15. I'm not sure what the exchange rate would be right now. So they can borrow up to that amount, but they have to save that 10%. And once they've got that savings well underway, then the people who are involved then have to register as a cooperative in almost all cases. And that in and of itself has several steps, and more steps have been involved as they've kind of realized that people need more education before they undertake this. And then once they have the cooperative is then the entity that borrows the money for the upgrading from Cody, which Cody charges, I believe it's still 4%. And then from the cooperative on-lends to the individual households. They usually charge an additional couple of percent of interest. So it's a shared interest rate. And that interest covers the operating expenses of the different entities.
And that's important because, correct me if I'm wrong, first, that's probably a better interest rate than you could get otherwise. And second, you probably couldn't even get a loan in the first place in many cases.
It's primarily the latter. I think I talked to a Cody leader when they were first starting to get this going and looking at trying to get formal lenders, and asking what the interest rate would be. They're like, well, it's a theoretical interest rate. Like you just wouldn't get an interest rate. Yeah. And it is subsidized. These are soft loans. There is the interest rate is subsidized. And so that's actually, that sounds complicated enough, but that's actually the neat and clean version of it. What actually happens is in the process of doing this, you have to imagine, what it's like to think about putting your money together with your neighbors, and then not just that, but going into debt with people. There's an enormous amount of trust that has to be created between people. There's an enormous amount of internal politics that happens about who's going to lead it, who's going to manage it. And at the beginning stages, there's often a lot of turnover. People will say they're going to do it, they'll get started, they'll pull out. As a cooperative starts to get up and going, or especially as a savings group starts to get up and going, people will be like, okay, well, I see this is happening. I guess I'll join. And then there are cases where people might want to join, but they, don't have the ability to put that kind of skin in the game.
Yeah. I mean, I think about, like, if I were just trying to buy a home with a couple friends, like the complexity of
that's
that
already complicated.
Alone would already be, like multiple people signing onto a mortgage. Like, what happens if someone falls behind? Just doing that with one friend would be daunting. So to do this with a group of people
upwards
who
of
may
100.
barely know, yeah.
And it's important to state that sometimes it is with people you barely know or don't know.
Right.
What happens in two of the case studies that I focus on. In one case, it was 5 different settlements came together, and in another, it was 4. So it was this select group of people from settlements who were threatened with immediate eviction, and there were only, a dozen or, a couple dozen people or even just a handful from these different settlements who were all willing to do it, but none of them had a critical mass. And so either Cody staff or these NGO organizers, facilitated them coming together. So in a lot of cases, those residents are actually taking this huge leap to become financially and eventually physically in space tied to people they don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a huge leap.
On this mechanics question, so you have a group of houses next to each other. Can some people participate and some people not participate? And how does that eventually work out?
That is like the $1 million question, I think, when you're doing in situ or in place upgrading.
Right.
And I think what happens sometimes is, I know in one of my case study communities, they had sort of divided the community. What they'll do is they'll divide the community into zones, and they'll say, okay, like, this zone is going to do it. And so sometimes that means that, okay, this other group of people are never going to do it, and we're just going to kind of, like, they're going to get pushed to the side. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that means that people really get pressured to join this. There's an enormous amount of pressure when, all the people around you are doing this, and you're the holdout. Sometimes people are the holdouts because they're the powerful people in the community, and they're like, okay, well, maybe I can, get some better terms or something. But yeah, I mean, when you're doing it in place, that is a really hard thing to get. There is a lot of pressure to get everybody on board.
Right. And there's no rule of, I mean, because sometimes, like with redevelopment of multifamily buildings, if you get 90% of the people to agree, then it happens. In this case, I don't know if there's a rule like that, or the idea is that you would just try to get consensus, and if you can't, I just imagine a lot of informal mechanisms of pressuring people, and then maybe even trying to kick people out or get new people into the neighborhood in order to make it all work.
Yeah, I think it's like, so I don't know of any like 90% rule in this case, but I think like of all the possibilities you just listed, like it's like, all of the above and to different degrees in different communities.
Sure. Yeah. Okay.
And yeah, like there are mechanisms through which, in the case where you have people who really can't do the saving and can't do the financial things, that they can build a central house. That's one way that they can like pull people along who really like are, whether they're disabled or elderly or something, they can get pull along. But yeah, there is a lot of pressure.
And people can participate to different degrees. So, everyone doesn't have to be getting the same loan, or do they all have to get the same amount?
So they don't all have to borrow the same amount. If people have, say, a lot of materials from their existing houses that they want to use for reconstruction, if they're moving or if they're just reblocking, they might not need, they're just kind of like adjusting things and they just need materials. So if they don't need a ton of, if they can substitute either with their own labor or with materials that they already have, they don't need to take out that much money. There are also generally more than one housing model that they build in a community. Often it will be like a row house versus freestanding, or a single story versus 2-story, and they can borrow. One will be less expensive, and so they can borrow according to their need that way.
And so that's was my next question too. Is my understanding is there's kind of a community agreed upon minimum quality level that all the new houses will have afterwards.
Yeah, and so it's interesting, and I think even some of the main architects, like literally and figuratively, architects of the policy from the beginning, have in recent publications lamented that the designs of the houses have become more sort of cookie cutter. But
I mean, it's cheaper though, so
it
So you get
is.
a lot of cookies.
It is, but there is a set design that people have to agree to build to.
Right.
And it's not just like a minimum standard by the community, because I think a lot of communities would agree to a much lower standard. Like they do have to they have to meet building codes and things like that.
Yep.
So that's often a big thing, but it's interesting, I studied case studies. I specifically studied a couple that were older and who had gone through the process and were pretty much done. And then I studied newer ones. And the older ones, if you talk to the leaders about the design process of making their houses, they just light up. And I think, Cody was really into making these participatory and using all kinds of materials and letting people kind of imagine their new homes and their new futures. And the newer ones were kind of handed options. And the one community even, like the designs they were given didn't show where the door was, and they were just like, no, and they started to find ways that they might hire another architect to redo it. So yeah, so those are some of the things that I think have changed over time,
Right.
along with the scale of the program.
Yeah.
I'm curious, from the perspective of the government, what are they trying to achieve? Like, what are they getting out of this program?
So it's hard to talk about the Thai government. Well, for a number of reasons, it's politically hard. But also, the government so the face of this program is from the government end is Cody. Cody is often called a quasi-governmental or parastatal or things like that. But I think from the perspective of a lot of people I talk to, they are a government entity in a lot of really important ways. Mm-hmm. And so there's that. I think from higher levels of government, if we're talking about the landowning agencies, they are getting housing on this land that, for one thing, looks nicer. There is definitely a beautification aspect to this, particularly when you start talking about settlements along canals.
Yeah, you mentioned the canal tour, and it often showed poor quality housing in the past.
Yeah, right? Bangkok was at one point, it has in multiple places throughout time been called the Venice of the East, and that is definitely something that they're trying to reclaim with some canal. But there's another side of the canal redevelopment, which is sort of climate change related. In 2011, there were massive floods. Now, the reasons for those were quite political as to, what measures were taken to prevent which areas from flooding versus not flooding. But that's one of the reasons that some of the, especially a new version of this is taking place. So I think that's part of it. And the other is that, it is in the interest of a government, of a state, to have people housed well for all kinds of reasons. And this is a way, yes, there are subsidies involved. There are grants for infrastructure, and other things. There are, the interest rates are subsidized, but a whole lot of the cost is being shared by communities themselves. It is a very cost-effective way to create housing.
Yeah. And you make a point here that, maybe this is more the appeal to the residents, but there's this element of sort of legitimating them or formalizing them, bringing them into the formal economy, which I think is a benefit both to the residents and the government itself. I think they would see that as a goal of theirs as well.
Yeah, I mean, being able to count people, and also for the residents being counted. Yeah. Those are goals that both sets of people can have.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned the kind of multiple goals it's trying to achieve but that's something that is very common in housing policy, right? Especially kind of when dealing with quote unquote slum areas. And I think, for people that haven't looked into this area of research or kind of policy inquiry before, thinking about this compared to other ways governments try to deal with a neighborhood on the side of a canal with poor housing conditions, right? And you think about like government resettlement programs into public housing as like being maybe the least successful version. And so some form of community involved redevelopment is generally kind of what works the best, but it's just complicated, right? There's a lot of issues you have to deal with.
Yeah, it's complicated, and especially, there are a lot of what I emphasize and what I'm trying to push back in this article is that I think a lot of the literature around this and similar models has been on the potential empowering impacts of collective finance. Mm-hmm. That by offering people the chance to manage finances collectively, to create resources, that this is like a catalyst of community empowerment and of communities being able to, participate politically because they have more financial resources, or it's like the glue that keeps people together. Mm-hmm. And I want to push back against that, because I think that there are aspects of this program, especially when people are connected with other communities, and especially when they come together to, fight or stave off eviction, or when they work with wider networks to push for policy changes. There are aspects of this that are really empowering. And what I have seen of how people go about managing these collective assets and debts, it's complicated, it's stressful, it puts them in positions relative to their neighbors that they may not want to be in. Mm-hmm. And it is like, we have to recognize that even if this maybe is better than relocation to, some public housing far away from their original land, they are taking on some of the financial burden. Mm-hmm. And there is pressure. It is in multiple people's interests for them to do that.
Right. Yeah. I think you see some of that same motivation here in the US with things like community land trusts and tenant opportunity to purchase programs, these kinds of things. You started to get at this just a moment ago. In the paper, you set up what I think is a really important contrast between empowerment and responsibilization. Could you explain that distinction for our listeners and maybe kind of talk about how that manifests in this program?
So I think we often think of empowerment as like, maybe, this is a slippery term, and it gets especially slippery because it gets applied to this program, even though there's not a great translation in Thai for it, which is kind of funny. But, empowerment, I think of as like increasing your ability to do something. It's saying like, you can do this, or we can do this. And then when something slips into responsibilization, it's like, oh, we have to do this.
Right.
So the program isn't just allowing people to do certain things, including and especially the management of financings. It is requiring them to do it.
It's like their only path to doing this.
Yeah. And it's their only path to doing this particular thing. And also we have to recognize that, this is a voluntary program at the end of the day, but people are, when they choose to do this program, they are operating within a very circumscribed set of choices. Mm-hmm. And so that's where I think responsibilization comes into play, is that, they're doing this program and they are taking on a lot of risk for themselves, sometimes in the case of leaders, for their community members, and then often in cases where the development is really being pushed from any number of state agencies.
On that, I was wondering what you thought about. I mean, a counterfactual would be a similar program, but without the community part, and instead just each person would have a direct relationship, or each household, with the government agency that was doing the similar kind of lending. I guess it's we're entering into gross speculation here, but how do you think that would change the way this works? Or even I was thinking, might be in a better situation, give communities the option of doing it through a community cooperative or one-on-one with the government.
Right.
Yeah. So it's hard to speculate. I think that some people might prefer that, but it's important to realize, so a couple points. One is that the finance works in part because the risk is reduced because you are relying on people's social capital to ensure repayment. You are relying on social pressure that is, in a sense, sort of collateralizing people's social capital. That is one of the reasons that the finance works.
The community pressure subsidy.
Yes.
Yeah. Whereas if it was just you in a relationship with the government, if you walked away, that would be between you and the government. No one's really gonna.
And it would be harder for them to. It would be harder for them to go after you.
Yeah.
Less politically tenable.
Yeah. And I know in one of my case studies, there is a house that someone just walked away from. Like it still happens. But I think it's also important to think about why collective tenure. And this gets to a couple of things. First is just the debates around titling. And so one of the reasons that Baan Mankong, I think, is, and this model is popular, is that for a while there was this idea that, famously associated with Hernando de Soto, that like all people needed in these informal environments was like an individual title, and that would, awaken dead capital, and they would have these financial resources and be pulled into the formal market. And that got critiqued both logically and with some evidence that, when you give somebody an individual title, now that the increased value that brings to that land and to that house will actually, if the person is very poor, the value of that new asset will be greater to them than the value of that place as a home, and they'll sell and basically be displaced by market forces. So that's one of the motivations for having this be a collective thing. But I mean, I think beyond that, and the reason I say, like, I remain, despite my critiques, sympathetic to this program and others like it is that it is, like, it's this way of imagining a way of being in the city outside of private property. You can call it the commons, you can call it what you like, but I, like I said, like, it's, housing policies are rarely about housing, and especially these type of collective housing policies, they're not just about producing housing, they're about producing different ways of life, different ways of being in the city. So I think that's, even though I think you are correct that there are probably actually lots of people going through this program who would say, like, can you just give me a loan? Can I just do this on my own? I think on the financial side, people would object to that. But then also, I think at least from the higher levels of the people running the organizations involved, that wouldn't like meet the goals, and it wouldn't have the government backing, because like the community aspect is actually also a really big part of why people hire in the government really like this.
Yeah. I mean, it really brings up a side tangent that I won't get into, but about how kind of low income communities in slums are forced to do this, but then rich communities aren't. But what I did want
I think that is worth talking about. Like that's what I'm interested in is this idea of like, I don't know, like
paternalistic community empowerment.
Well, maybe it's like the distinction between the collective aspect of this and the participatory aspect of it. Like those aren't necessarily the same thing. And the participatory part maybe seems like the bigger burden. And it's also an opportunity for many people, but it's sort of like forcing everyone to be part of an HOA. And like HOAs are famously terrible. But some people are really into it because they like leading an HOA and being that person. But those of us who have been, part of a volunteer organization or an HOA or whatever know that the person who like speaks up and wants to lead is not necessarily the most competent person all the time. So I'm just, I just don't know. Like I think your point, Pablo, about like having the option for people, if you could do that without forcing it, would be ideal. But, Hayden, your point about how you kind of lose that social pressure, maybe I'm not sure you can totally cleave away the collective part from the participatory. They seem, kind of overlapping in some ways.
Yeah. And I have thought about this a lot. And I think at the end of the day, I come away from this particular program and I think a lot of, whether we're thinking about community land trusts or limited equity co-ops, thinking that, I think they're a really great option for some people.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I think what you have to understand then about Baan Mankong is it has always purported to be the scalable version of all of this. Like the initial, it has never reached the like initial projections that it wanted for the first 5 years, but it's reached, 113,000 households, I think, as of the most recent report, much higher if you consider some of the sister programs.
That's important context we didn't share.
Yeah,
this is a really huge program. It's not just
really
like 5 communities or something.
And the ambitions in the next 20 years are to grow it like 4 or 5 fold. Mm-hmm. But I think, and this idea is not mine. I have to credit Eli Elenoff with this, who has also studied not Baan Mankong per se, but has done some really excellent research that involves about sort of local democracy and the politics of citizenship that takes place in a community going through Baan Mankong. Is that this collective aspect, it creates this form of differentiated citizenship. If we conceive of different ways of having rights in the city being associated with property, you have, wealthier people who can do all of these things on their own, but poorer people can only do it collectively. And there's this, he has a great quote in his book, which I will plug, with Citizen Designs, came out this year with University of Hawaii Press, where one of the people who's going through it is thinking about, not doing it, and says they want to like upgrade their status to be an individual. That's like their ambition in life. And yeah, like I think people feel that, and even some of the organizers who have more radical ideals around that, the communities that are associated with that, people feel a great deal of ambivalence.
Yeah, and so where I wanted to go before that useful tangent was very much connected to this, and it's the limited equity part of this, right? Because you could have the same program, but at the end of the process, you're allowed to sell it on the market, right? And that would make everything work probably differently. In this case, you can't, right? So am I understanding it correctly that if you want to move, you can sell, but at a price that the collective determines? And do people do that? And what are those prices generally like?
Yeah, I am a little limited in how much I can speak to this. So I know in the sort of bylaws of the cooperative that I've looked at, there isn't like how you might have in a community land trust, like a set, formula for this, that it really is, it's determined by a vote and by the committee and by the collective. I think the ambition of a lot of people, at least at the high level, is that this is like a more permanent way that of being together. But I think when the loans are paid off, they're 15-year terms, to my knowledge, they have the option of dissolving the cooperative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was curious about that. Like once, like if you were to sell, does the buyer take on some kind of special responsibilities to the collective, or is it like if the loan is paid, you can wash your hands of it and just kind of live your life?
So they would, if they did that, they would have to, split the deed individually. This is maybe other people know more details about this than I do. But when I finished my field work, which was in 2018, that was exactly 15 years after Baan Mankong started in earnest in 2003. Now, some pilot programs were before that, so there were some communities as I was there that were kind of coming to the end of their repayment period. And I'm not entirely sure, none of them were, I didn't do case studies of any of them, but I think in probably, maybe not by now because COVID has, Cody did pause repayments for COVID reasons. So, but I think like from now in the next few years, there are going to be a lot of communities that are coming to the end of their repayment periods. And it's an open question as to what they do, whether they choose to stay together, whether they, choose to split their deeds. But there's not that intention, at least in this program. Like I believe in the community mortgage program in the Philippines, it's like the intention of the program, to my understanding, that they're going to individualize the titles. That is not like set here.
I mean, on the limited sales prices, I know we don't have all the details on this, but I was thinking about this as well, where like, again, thinking about a US context, something like a community land trust, that always entails some kind of public funding, and usually pretty substantial funding, where it's, the homes are purchased, and because grants were involved, the price, it sells for less than it otherwise would to a lower moderate income buyer, and they can only sell it at a slightly inflated rate rather than the market price. And that makes sense because it was public money and they want to get the most out of it that they can. This is a little different, where there is the subsidy on like the interest rate maybe, and maybe they're eating some losses on loans that don't get paid back, but like it is largely shouldered by the households themselves, and these are pretty poor households mostly. And so on the one hand, they're shouldering all the risk, or much of the risk, but the upside is really limited, and so they can't just like sell if they've been successful. It just seems like, I mean, a great deal for for the government anyway, for Bangkok to like have put all this responsibility on these households and settlements, and yet if it fails, it's really on those households as well. But if it succeeds, like that's future, high quality housing, and it's affordable, and all these positive things that benefit society kind of more broadly.
Yeah, I have really kind of mixed feelings about this. I think that's because the people I saw going through the process sometimes have mixed feelings about this. Mm-hmm. I think that, I think for one that I didn't see this in any of my case study communities, but I know it has been a concern among like Coady staff and other observers I talked to, that, informally people are kind of selling, and getting some kind of profit off of it. And they can get some kind of profit. Like the price agreed to can be like, give them something.
Well, it does seem, I mean, a 15-year term, people move a lot. Like,
yeah,
for everyone to commit to living there for 15 years at least just seems totally.
Oh yeah, and people do get replaced. And one of the challenges and one of the reasons, and this did happen, I think, in one of my communities where they, people leave, basically get kicked out because they fall behind. Like, and there's, but when they want someone to come in, they need somebody then who can like make up those payments too. So that necessarily means that a wealthier person is coming in.
Yeah.
But I think too, it's important to realize what people are investing in is not, it is a status. It is a nicer house. That is important to some people. And I have this very distinct memory from field work where I was talking to one of the leaders of a community, and she was not having a good day. People were not paying. She was trying to enforce late fees. People were upset with her. And I asked her, why are you doing this? And this was in her, was pre-eviction. She was in her, kind of wooden self-built house along a canal. And she just gestured to her daughters and she said, for them. Mm-hmm. And that was enough for her, because after 15 years, it's theirs. There's a place, there's a safe, steady place to live. And I think it is important. It was interesting. On a totally other note, I was recently reading the most recent Coady annual report, and they are trying to kind of, I don't know if this is just to like drum up support, but trying to come up with like the actual value that has accrued to some of the land, and potentially some of the people. So I think there are movements in that direction too. But I think people do this for non-monetary reasons.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we're just about out of time here, but is there anything we missed? I know we had even more questions in our list. There's just so much to cover, but is there anything like key that you wanted to talk about before we go?
Yeah, I guess I think to close it up, I when it comes down to it, the way I've been thinking about, this program and community-led processes, a lot of people can look at these sorts of things and see their politics reflected back at them. From the left, this looks like, an alternative to the market. From, other positions, it looks like an alternative to state provision. And I think my concern is that in this paper, at least, is when we celebrate sort of the community managed finance part, we start to celebrate it going away, that it becoming that sort of that alternative to the state part. And I think when we look at these types of programs, we need to ask ourselves, is participating in them acting as a way of people demanding more resources from the state, of really gaining collective power, or is it acting as a substitute for redistribution of resources? And I think sometimes you can't tell the answer to that just by looking at a model. You have to see how it's playing out on the ground.
Yeah, you have a quote that I made a note of about how this blurs the boundaries between radical alternatives to the market and neoliberal alternatives to the state, which I think is a really astute way of putting this. So for the last question, we usually ask this, but I'm especially interested this time because you were in Bangkok for years, but now you're back. What's next for you?
The future of research on this in particular is quite up in the air, and COVID, making this sort of thing especially difficult. But I'm in Cincinnati now. I'm back in the U.S. and I am still really interested in these collective ways of holding land. And so I presented a paper at a conference in the fall, kind of doing a lit review and looking at different models of collective tenure around the world, and thinking about, how they're the same, how they're different, how they're in conversation with one another. So I'm interested in thinking about the implications of different institutional arrangements on these things, but I'm also really interested in collective tenure as traveling policy, and the ways in which people are sharing knowledge about it, and what it is that we choose to be the things that are replicable, and whether those are the right things. I think that's definitely one answer as well, where I'm going, as well as, getting involved in housing stuff in Cincinnati and understanding what's going on here.
Yeah, and can I just jump in and say, more than most of the papers, I'd highly recommend reading this one, because there is a lot that we didn't get into. I mean, we didn't even talk about the patriarchy element and the gender nature of work, and then the whole policy mobility stuff you just brought up about how this became a model that other countries are trying to adopt, and the Asian Coalition for Housing Rights trying to export. So I think I would recommend to listeners, go check out the paper.
Thank you very much. And I recommend the podcast.
Hayden Shelby, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
You can read more about Professor Shelby's research and find our show notes and a transcript of the interview at our website, lewis.ucla.edu. The UCLA Lewis Center is on Facebook and Twitter. I am on Twitter at Shane D. Phillips, and Pavo is there at L Pavo. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.